was just speaking to my friend in Australia, and mentioned I'd be talking to you, and he asked me specifically to give you his love. He's also a great big admirer.
Oh, thank you.
He was in a violent, abusive relationship himself some years ago, and you were an inspiration to him. So, anyway, all right. Well, see if I can see myself very well. Just my own camera a bit. All right. Well, this will be episode 2 of the Honeybadger Files. This time my guest is international domestic violence advocate and expert Erin Pizzey. Good morning, Erin. How are you?
Good morning. It's very cold.
It's very cold, is it?
Yes.
Oh, it's early December. I guess it is cold. You're living in London these days, yes?
Yes, I am.
So you have recently, last year or so, published a book called This Way to the Revolution, a memoir from Peter Owen Publishers. What can you tell me about that book, Erin?
Well, I've always tried to tell the truth about the beginnings. I was one of the first people in England to get involved with the women's movement. And what I saw there, I knew perfectly well was going to be extremely destructive. And when I began to stand up at these great big collective meetings, interestingly enough, there were a lot of women from America who came over with initial instructions to actually show the British women how to be radical feminists. They're a pretty frightening crowd, and I got screamed at a lot, partly because I said many of women like myself who were married, with or without children, were perfectly happy to have the choice to be able to stay home. So in the end, last year actually, it took me 10 years to get this book published. It was turned down by every major publisher in this country. And finally, Peter Owen, who are a fine, very small publishing company, agreed that they would publish. They've done a wonderful job of it. It's the whole truth of what went on behind the movement, the feminist movement. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
Well, so you say the feminist movement, the women's movement. I confess I haven't read the entire book yet, but I've at least read part of it. It's certainly It's certainly very interesting. Would you say that you considered yourself a feminist in the very early days?
I consider myself, like many, many women across the world, an equity feminist. I believed in equality for everyone. And there were issues that needed discussing. But as soon as I saw, because you have to remember my background, my parents were caught by the communists in 1949, and we didn't see them for 3 years. They were under house arrest.
Your parents were caught by the communists?
Yes, in 1949. My father was in Tianjin, in the Foreign Office, and they came to China. They marched up the driveway, and they were arrested. They were very lucky, my parents, because they were under house arrest. Most of the others were getting into prisons. And one very close family member came out completely insane from what had happened to him. So I had no love of communism from the very beginning. But what I saw in these great big collectives was really Marxism. We were all organized into groups in our own homes and told that we must have consciousness raising sessions. And I remember the woman who came to our consciousness raising. And when she finished, I said, but this has nothing to do with women. This is actually Marxist. I mean, I said, we're going to dispose to work full time, put our children into care, provided by the state, like the communist government, and why are we calling this liberation? And so very quickly, I was booted out and went off to actually open a community center for mothers and children. And then I knew once donations came in, once the press picked it up, because the local paper, because my refuge by that point was full, I knew very well that there'd be the sound of the feminist boots coming down to actually hijack the entire domestic violence industry and turn it into a billion-dollar industry, which they've done.
Well, those are very powerful words and statements. So I understand you were born in China then, yes?
Yes.
Or something you and your family were there when they turned communist.
No. When I was born in China, But then my parents were reposted to China when I was about 11 years old. And they were reposted to Tientsin, and that's where they were incarcerated.
Oh, I see. I see. Yet I can already hear some people objecting. I've met a lot of women who consider themselves feminists in some form or other, and they look at you like you're from Mars if you say this business about it being Marxist in origin or...
Yes, but they have to... Most of them don't even know anything about the beginning of this movement. And the thing I have to point out, very simply, the beginnings of the women's movement happened way back when a lot of women were fighting for the rights of people, of Americans, to end the apartheid that was going on at that time. When they had finished marching for the civil rights movement, there's a whole story history that you can read it. They came back and decided that the women, leftist women, wanted their own movement. So instead of it being capitalism, which everybody was against in the left-wing movements, they simply changed the goalposts and said it was patriarchy. Everything was because of men, because of the power that men have over women. And then the second part of the argument was that all women are victims of men's violence because it's the patriarchy. And that is such a lot of rubbish. Because we know, everybody in the business knows, that both men and women in interpersonal relationships can be violent. And that's in every single study all across the Western world. But all this time, for 40 years, we've been living a big lie led by these feminist women who essentially have created a huge billion-dollar industry all across the world, and they have shut the doors on men. No men can work in the refuges. No men can sit on boards. Boys under the age of 12 often can't go into the refuges. A mother has to make a difficult choice of what she can do.
Can you do me a quick favor and push your camera up a bit again, because I'm still seeing. I'm only getting the top of your head. Oh, there we are. There we are. All right. Sorry. Here in the U.S., I've at least come across a few shelters which employ men in some fashion to act as guards at the doors or.
That's not working in a refuge, isn't it? Standing outside.
Standing outside or picking women up and driving them places. Yes.
Not as staff, though, not as working in the refuge. In my refuge, half the staff are always men because they're so important for children who haven't known good, kind men. And some of the mothers.
I understand. That makes good sense. I mean, I see from your memoir, for example, that in the early 60s you had to show proof that you intended to get married just to get contraception from your doctor, and
yes,
women couldn't apply for mortgages, and so I presume it's that sort of thing that made you interested in the women's movement in the first place.
Yes, absolutely. And I had such a vision, and partly the refuge, because I know all about violence. Both my parents were violent. My mother was particularly violent to me because I looked like my father. And the other two, my twin sister and my brother, were much more like her. And my whole concern is, it is generational violence. And if we don't save this generation of children, we simply have more and more violent people. Because until we understand that we cannot blame men for everything. Women have to look at themselves to be honest about their own violence. And also, to understand what you do to a child's brain when you actually fight, beat each other up, scream, yell, and hit children. It causes brain damage. And we know that now from MRI scans. They can see what it does, particularly to the frontal lobe, the right frontal lobe, which is the seat of all our emotions.
There was a psychologist in Canada who recently published a piece asserting that the stereotype that we seem to all accept now of the helpless, innocent woman who is beaten on by a brutish, thuggish man and needs to run away represents perhaps only 4 or 5% of all domestic violence cases, and that almost all of their cases are more complicated than that, Would you agree that that sounds about reasonable?
Yes, of the first 100 women came into my refuge, 60% were as violent as the men they left, or the men, they were violent and the men weren't. The 40%...
They were violent and the men weren't?
Yeah. And that's why I tried to open a house for men almost immediately after I opened the refuge for women. And my problem was, and this is a great shock to me, I was given a house at a peppercorn rent by the council. And then I asked men who had actually given money for my refuge for women and children, they were millionaires, to give me some money for the men's house, and none of them would give a penny.
I happen to know that in Canada there's exactly one men's shelter, and it can't get any funding. It's almost impossible. It's running on a shoestring budget. I'll have to make sure to let people know about it after I finish talking to you. But I see from your memoir you actually said your first experience of wanting to open a shelter for women was you encountered a woman who was beaten and bloodied or bruised. And you said you immediately flashed to your own experience of having been beaten by your mother.
Actually, no, it was worse than that. It was a bit like Psycho. When my mother died at the council, and I was 17, my twin sister, my brother was 14. My father refused to bury her body, and he had it in the house on the dining room table, and he had to go and look every night. It was hot. It took 6 days before he allowed her to be buried. This is the point, though. Everyone in the village knew what was going on. The woman across the road, who was a fat family friend, I ran across and begged her to help me. She didn't. The doctor was called by my father, and he examined my mother's dead body and came out and said this shouldn't be happening to a dog. He did nothing. So I sat there at the age of 17 thinking, I have asked for help. Nobody will help 3 terrified children. So when Kathy said to me, it was the words, no one will help me, that's when I knew I had to take her in and look after her.
So you feel you were abused by both of your parents?
Yeah, all 3 of us were.
Oh, sorry that happened to you.
No, you have to remember, that's how I know what I know, and that's why I can do what I do.
So it would be your firm opinion then that work by researchers like Murray Strauss and whatnot that
and Richard Gelling. Yeah.
that most domestic violence is consensual, mutual.
One way or another. It's not. There's no pattern for this because each person's unique, and why and how they make relationships is unique. But they do need. I think, and I say this often to very violent women, look, you're with a very violent man, that was your choice. But now you want to break that cycle. Think of him as your heroin pusher. If you stay away from him, just like cold turkey, long enough, that need for him will die. Freud said a long time ago that in time to come, all emotions will be found in chemicals of the brain, and he's so right, and that's why I call it an addiction. It's the same way as an alcoholic is for his bottle, drug addict for the needle, and a violent relationship for some people. But it can be broken.
What about women who are the predominant aggressors? You've run across those as well, I take it?
They were in my refuge. And we had long-term therapeutic care. We had the mother house, the big mother house, and then we had shared accommodation in houses. And we also had many houses right the way across England, and the Palm Court Hotel. That was the sort of second stage. It had 74 private suites, and we squatted that, and that was long, so you could stay there as long as you liked, and you were ready to move back into the community.
I find that when I speak about domestic violence issues, and I have written and done some work in this area for more than 10 years. You were a bit of an inspiration there, by the way. But in any case, people, and sometimes it's people who call themselves feminists, but often it's people who call themselves conservatives, or maybe even Tories, like you'd call them, or just everyday, not very political people, either look at either become enraged with me or look at me like there's something very silly about me when I say there is a serious problem with violent women, that perhaps a quarter of domestic violent relationships, it is the woman who is mostly the violent one, and probably in half or more it's both of them who are violent in one way or another. And I think you're nodding. I think you agree that that sounds about right.
Yes,
But people become either frightened or enraged or laugh when you suggest that there are violent women. Where do you think that comes from?
most people who are violent don't think they're violent because it's been their reality from a very early age. And that's why I don't even go out to dinner now. Because if I sit down at the table and I can look at people mostly and know what they've been up to, a lot of it's defensive. A lot of it.
What do you mean it's defensive?
They know within themselves how they behave, and they don't want to hear about it.
I think that you mentioned feminism as a sort of liberal leftist movement, which I think it was originally, although you do have women who are consider themselves.
Yeah, at some point, try and read Susan Brown Miller's book, because she sent me her books on rape at the very beginning. I couldn't read them, bless her heart, but she's since recanted. And that's the amazing thing. I was also at the American Embassy when Betty Friedan recanted what she'd said, and she said, I apologize. We as women have gone from male to throat over economics, and that isn't what we should have done. We should have looked at relationships between men and women.
Betty Friedan said that.
Yes, she did, American Embassy, about 1980, 81. And I just remember looking at her and thinking, but look at the damage you've done with what you've said over the years. It's all very well, everybody recanting, but the damage is done.
Well, and where is the knowledge that they've recanted? Susan Brown Miller published a simply horrible screed about rape and how...
No, she's since then written a book with friends. I know her. She since then wrote a book and just said, I was wrong.
Really?
Yeah.
That's actually good for me to hear, because her original writings on rape about it being this, I don't know, men have been raping women for millions of years, and very upsetting stuff, but it's interesting to hear that you're friends and that she's recanted her views on that. I'd probably like to talk to her sometime, but it seems to me as if people either want to see women as exclusively victims or as somehow angelic figures.
And that's mostly men. Women know. We know each other. And privately they'll say what they really believe. But an awful lot of men will not hear a word about violent women. You know, they like women on pedestals. It makes them feel safe.
So then it's not just the feminists, although the feminists appear to be part of it. The feminists get angry and the men become derisive or protective. They don't want to believe there can be violent women. Seems like.
No, but once you start saying to any group like radical feminists, look, we have a problem that we need to resolve among women, you're talking about almost saying, possibly, there is $1 million industry out there. You have to share it with men, because men and women can equally be violent. Then you're actually talking about money, and they aren't going to give up on that. They've built an empire over 40 years, very, very powerful. And now we have women in very powerful situations, Canada, Australia, and here, because at one point, the official solicitor, the Attorney General in this country was a woman. Harriet Harman is a woman who does huge amounts of damage, and she's been the women's minister. And I have awful problems with her and several others, because they're now very powerful. They're powerful in the judiciary, they're powerful in social services, particularly Canada. That's one of the worst countries in the world.
Harriet Harman, she's a member of Parliament there in Britain. Yes, all right. Yeah, I've read about her. She seems very hateful. She is a feminist. Yes.
Well, I tried to reason with her once. We were both at a conference, and I just said to her, look, Harriet, you've simply got to accept the figures of violent women. She just swung around on me, and her face changed. She said, the amount of men who are beaten up is minuscule. And I just looked at her and I thought, there's nothing I can do with you, because your mind's closed.
Well, the government's own figures don't even show that to be true, do they?
Yes, the British home crime figures show virtually equal between men and women, domestic violence. It doesn't matter how often you say this, and you point it out. You tell a lie long enough, Goebbels said, you can brainwash the entire community, and that's what's happened here.
Now, there are those who would be accusing you of being a conspiracy theorist or some sort of crazy person to suggest that the domestic violence industry is that it's a billion-dollar industry.
That's not too difficult. I mean, just look at the figures if you can get your hands on them.
Like what figures?
How much VAWA, I think is what you call it, gets every year.
The Violence Against Women Act in America.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's an incredible amount of money the government funds, and it goes to these shelters, and it's not accounted for, as far as I know.
But I bet a lot of it doesn't get near the shelters. Most of it will go to all the administrative and the legal battles of the feminists. It pays. Look, it's always funded the women's movement, everywhere.
Really?
Yes. That's why I wrote the book, because somebody's got to say it loudly.
That there is a problem with it, particularly with the feminist movement at this point, because of the money they get from government and private charitable donations. Yes. Would you say that they also rely on people's perhaps instinctive need to protect women without thinking rationally about?
Well, just imagine. I mean, the two people on my board, the 3 or 4 of them were millionaires. Yeah, and they were very protective of women. And when you present them with the fact that men equally need protecting, they fill up their pockets. What I did in the end, I couldn't keep the house open, as none of us had any money. But I did, a very nice woman created charity shops, and we called them Men's Aid. And that employed a man to go and see every single man who wanted to see us.
I see, but you haven't been successful in continuing that sort of thing?
No, because I managed to open the house, and some men were ready to come in, but I couldn't get a penny from anybody.
I'm going to have to ask you, you couldn't get a penny from anybody for helping men? Still can't, really?
No, you can't.
No, it's horrible. Something should be done. Once again, can you angle your camera a bit more this way? Because I'm only seeing your nose. Oh, there we are. Thank you. Thank you. All right, you recently were quoted, I saw this on a video somewhere, and you just said something earlier, the most frightening country in the entire world is Canada.
Yeah.
That seems a bit hyperbolic.
Sorry, it's breaking up.
I'm breaking up. Okay, let me see if we get this. Is that better?
Yeah.
I said you were quoted as saying that the most frightening country in the entire world is Canada. Now, that seems a bit hyperbolic and might be out of context because I presume, well, I think people from places like Saudi Arabia or North Korea might wish to take issue with you, but I take it you mean that in the area of domestic violence, feminism, laws against men, that sort of thing?
Yes, I do. I did it with a 6-week tour with Senator Ann Cools all across Canada. And there was some there's one in Windsor, was a wonderful men's group, just struggling to keep going. And as we traveled and talked to men's groups, we realized how terribly dangerous it is, because it's almost as though the entire government and the judiciary, and the same people, have been infiltrated by very radical feminists out to get men. And I talked to people all the way across Canada. My mother was Canadian. And I'm half Canadian. And it hurt, actually, because I was a child in Toronto. And my feeling as we went through is real fear. I remember I was working with Anne in the Senate, and I walked into a lift, and this man who was in the lift with me was cowering over in the corner. And I came out, I said to Anne, what on earth was that about? She said, men are frightened. They just don't know when they're going to be told they're sexually harassing somebody.
I'm sure there are Canadian and other men who are scoffing at this simply because they've never gotten into that situation, but
Those men scoff all over the world because it's not their situation. Where is the humanity in men for each other? We women have it naturally with each other. but men don't seem to have the same ability to discuss emotional issues.
It's an interesting thing because I noticed on Facebook you said something, I don't have an exact quote, but you were despairing that men's groups and men's movement never seem to go anywhere or get any traction. You still finding that to be true?
Yes, I do find that to be true. I really do. And it's a great sadness because it's the only way we're going to heal what's happened between the anti-male misandry and ordinary normal people in loving relationships is for men to take their lead in what's happening and make their opinions known and stand up. Because otherwise, it's this deepening divide in relationships between men and women.
Well, there is a growing men's movement. I think you'll be happy to hear. I do a lot of work on A Voice for Men and with others, and it does seem to be growing all of a sudden. It seems to be predominated by people who are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, who grew up in the wake of family destruction that we've seen since the 70s. So I think there's hope there, but I hope people listen to your words and are galvanized by them. Men do need to be less fearful of speaking up and more compassionate. I mentioned this to you in private conversation, but I'll mention it again. A year or so ago here in the United States, there was a man named Thomas Ball who was accused of molesting his child and went through 2 or 3 years of family court hell, having been accused, and eventually doused himself with gasoline and set himself on fire in front of a courthouse. And the press, to the extent they reported it at all, either behaved as if it was a bizarre mystery or it was a terrorist incident. And what does that say about a country when you have that reaction to a man in that much pain, willing to do something so horrible?
All I can say that is, for a start, relationships are probably, when they go wrong, the most devastating thing that can happen. The woman usually gets to keep the kids, and the man is suddenly out of the family link, and he's kept outside. He's kept outside by the law, the usual people. And I think the big tragedy of all this is, at the moment, nobody's listening. But I do take your point about it getting better, because I think your analysis is correct. And I think that there will come a tipping point when we'll get to where the truth of all this will come out. And all we can all do, those of us that are working this work, is to keep going and to keep going. And I hope in my lifetime we will see refuge and comfort and care for everyone, particularly children, because it's generational. And if we don't save the children of this generation, we create another generation of violent and desperate people.
Well, I know that even here in the States, it's quite common for most refuges not only to refuse men, but they'll refuse children if they're boys and they're over a certain age, such as 12 or 13.
12, yeah.
12 there. That's so. What are you teaching those young boys when you do that to them, do you think?
Yeah, as a case the other day, I was talking to the mother. She was completely bloodied after she'd been beaten up, and she got to the police station with her children. Her boy was 16, and the others. And when the Women's Aid came to collect her, they said, "You can't take your 16-year-old son." She said, "What can I do then?" She would have to make up her accommodation. And she said, "I left my son in the police station for the social services to collect him because I knew I couldn't cope for finding my own accommodation, and I wouldn't be protected." As you're quite right, how would that poor child, he's only 16, seen his mother beaten up for how many times, I couldn't count, left? That's, as far as I'm concerned, cruel.
It seems to be. And also maybe teaching him a message to internalize his father's anger and his father's violence and think, well, this is just what men are, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, I have a good friend, obviously I won't name him. He was in a relationship where his wife was very violent with him and very violent with his children. And he stayed in that relationship, even though it was going on for years, because he feared to call the police for help. He was certain he would be arrested.
It's right.
He was right, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Almost any man would be.
Listen to this. Who trains the police? Women's Aid.
Women's Aid.
Yeah, they all across for 40 years. They've been doing educational packages, which they then sell to whether it's the police or social services, and the message is always there. It's all men, it's all men, it's all men.
And it's a lie, isn't it?
It's a massive lie, yeah. And it's a very, 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 a lie worth telling because you get billions out of this. This is more about money than it is about caring for anybody.
Because it's both about government funding and charitable funding. Somehow you say women need help and purses open, checkbooks open. You say men need help, and what happens?
Men don't need help. We all know that men are violent brutes because they've got a Y chromosome, and women don't.
And that's just horribly sexist a thing to say, isn't it?
Isn't it? I mean, when they picketed, they used to have these pickets when they were picketing me, saying all men are bastards, all men are rapists. Well, my sons aren't, for a start.
And your own mother was quite a violent person, that you said.
But then you see, both sides, I could trace violence for 3 generations. And for every woman that came into the refuge, and we used to take about 1,000 mothers and children at the height of when we were working. We did, the first 100, as an example, we did a 3-generational questionnaire, and it answered itself. The women who came in who were innocent victims of their partner's violence didn't come from violent relationships. But the women who were victims of their own violence, that's where you saw the generational violence.
What do you mean victims of their own violence?
Well, look at it this way. Baby P, it was a big, big case here just recently. A child, a beautiful boy.
Once again, move your camera a bit for me. I'm so sorry.
This way?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, Baby P?
Yeah, he was a beautiful little boy who was hideously battered by his mother and her boyfriends. And he was taken into hospital and he died. And then everybody across the country was weeping over Baby P because it made the newspapers. And I said then, right, when this man grows up, this child, had he been able to grow up, he would probably have been a monster. And then you would hate him.
I think I see what you mean there, yes. Plus, would you say that women who get violent are in many ways victims of their own violence because...
Yes. What I'm looking for when I take care of people who are victims of their own violence is a way that they can transcend. I was saved by my mentor, Miss Williams. Without her, that's why my original memoir from my childhood is called Infernal Child, because I was a very, very violent, dangerous child.
Were you?
Yeah.
It's almost as if we're afraid to see women as human beings with the same flaws as men.
Isn't it awful? Because it's so condescending to tell all women they're victims. I'm not a victim. I make my choices and I take the consequences. I can say that to a woman. I say, look, you chose that man. You knew he was violent. You chose to have children by this man, even though you were being beaten up. Now you take some responsibility for this.
Well, and one of the patterns I've seen and read about is that you'll get these women in violent relationships, and they'll be the ones who actually start the hitting.
Yes, they do, because the majority of violent women bank on the fact that most men don't hit women, and they don't.
And most men don't hit women. And so then a woman will hit and hit and hit, and then finally he loses his mind and turns and punches her, and now she gets to be a victim, right?
Yeah, but sometimes she doesn't even have to wait to provoke him to where he loses it. She bangs her head on a wall and calls the police.
Now that's going to make some people angry. You just suggested women will intentionally injure themselves.
And some men. I mean, it's not just women or just men. It's what you learned in childhood. And a lot of these women that I deal with have severe personality disorders, as do the men. And whoever gets involved with them, even by accident mostly, is going to get, it's a train crash. Because it takes time for the loving partner to realize what they've taken on. And an interesting thing about men, when they see what they think is a very, very, what would the word be? A very fragile woman. And this is a classic. A narcissistic exhibitionist. There's the woman, the whole crowd at the party are looking at her. She's usually very well turned out because she's narcissistic. She looks good. And she's incredibly warm. It isn't until he gets deeper into the relationship that he realizes that there's nothing inside that woman. What he saw was harmed a child in the woman. And he wants to make it better. He wants to defend her, take care of her. And then suddenly realize the mask of sanity. And he sees through it, and it's too late.
Because everybody else sees her as
wonderful, light of the party. And he's drawn in by that. Men love to have a woman on their arm who everybody else would love to own.
Vivacious, pretty, etc.
But, like my mother, narcissistic exhibitionists, and they're very, very dangerous, and there's no treatment.
There was a famous case here in the States. Bobby Kennedy Jr. Got a divorce, and his ex-wife, shows all the patterns of being either a narcissist or what they call a borderline personality. And when she killed herself, everybody blamed him. And then it came out that she had borderline personality disorder, and Bobby Kennedy Jr., was at least somewhat vindicated. They ceased to accuse him of being abusive, and nobody really apologized or acknowledged the fact that, in fact, she had been violent toward him and his children, and nobody wanted to. It's like that part of it kind of got elided. Oh, well, she was mentally disturbed. And
wasn't she had a personality disorder? That's not mentally disturbed. She knew damn well what she was doing. And her final act of outrage to make sure he got even more damage was to kill herself.
So you're saying a borderline personality isn't mentally disturbed?
No.
Because their personality...
This is what I'm going to say now, and I know it's ahead of the game because MRI scans are only starting the big studies. Most borderline personality disorders and also narcissistic exhibitionists are damaged because they have witnessed or been part of violent parenting or dysfunctional parenting, and it's actually damaged the way the information goes to the brain. They can now show you where children who've been exposed to toxic violence and sexual abuse, they can now see in the right frontal lobe how the neurons and the damage that's done there. That's all to come because it's now happening, and there are big studies going on looking at children's brains who are already violent.
And yet, people still seem afraid of it. They seem afraid of the feminist movement. Do you think the feminist movement can reform itself and become something better, or is it time to just...
No, I think this new generation coming up, who are in their 20s now, have seen a lot of the damage, even in their own parenting, in feminist households. And I think they will grow up to be far more inclusive. And I think that in about 20 years perhaps, I don't know if I'll still be alive, but we would look at these last 40, 50 years as the dark ages for human relationships.
Because it should be humanism that we're talking about, and
yes. Love.
Helping each other.
Love, compassion, all the things that we need. We need to love and be loved. It's as simple as that. And this radical feminist really hijacked everything from the equity feminists, essentially is a hateful movement. It hates a whole group of people and wishes them ill.
You use the phrase equity feminism. Are you using that to describe women who think of themselves as feminists but really only want fairness and equality?
Yes, absolutely.
But perhaps even the word feminism isn't right at this point for them. They're really more humanists and don't realize it.
Yeah, I think that's right. But then you see, we've had nearly 50 years now of brainwashing. And this lie has been standing out there. But I do see more and more people realizing that there were 2 conferences in America, one in Sacramento.
Can we adjust that camera again a bit? I'm so sorry.
Right?
That's better.
I went to the one in Sacramento, and it was the first inclusive conference, and it was such a joy to be there. Murray Strauss was there.
Really?
And Charles, Corrie, that's right, he's wonderful. And Edward. There's a whole load of people that have been there from the very beginning. Then there was a second one in LA, and one of the women from the university said, I couldn't let anybody know that I was here from my university, or I'd lose my tenure. And she's right. She would.
Lose her tenure?
Yeah.
I thought that would be nearly impossible.
Yeah.
But it's almost like this radical feminism is underground. People don't know that it's there, and you try to tell them you think it's a conspiracy, but it's not a conspiracy, is it? It's just reality of what's in the university and a lot of these government departments, right?
That's where it came from. That's where it all started. And it's interesting though, because many of those women's studies are being shut down.
Well, it's funny, and they seem to be getting more and more desperate. I mentioned this to you earlier, but not on camera. Warren Farrell, you know him, yes?
He's a great friend.
Very sweet gentleman, and there is a growing men's movement. A Voice for Men is a big part of it, and but Warren Farrell was to give a talk at the University of Toronto, and feminists, people calling themselves feminists, so I suppose anybody watching this who says, well, I'm a feminist and I'm not like that, well, listen up. There are women calling themselves working in your name doing this, and men. They were getting extremely violent, locking arms, trying to bar people from getting in to see Warren Farrell speak. Some of them wound up getting arrested, calling people names, horribly abusing men who were trying to get in there. But it was all caught on camera, and this time some people were arrested, and I see that as positive in 2 ways. A, it's getting some coverage, and B, the police actually were willing to make an arrest or 2. Because didn't you say early on when 40, 50 years ago, the police wouldn't arrest violent women?
Well, no, when I first started, police weren't allowed to do anything to protect women or men because it was called a domestic. That's one of the first things we had to change.
Mm-hmm.
And now, of course, police, the problem with that, yes, they can go in and arrest, but in most cases, they will only arrest the man.
But I seem to recall you mentioning something about how perhaps 40, 50 years ago, in the 70s, there were violent women protesting you, and the police told you they were afraid of them?
That's absolutely right. I was at a luncheon called Women of the Year at the Savoy, and there was all this shouting. I had to get through the pickets, and the most funniest one was Pizzey is the Pits. But I also had the ones, all men are rapists, all men are bastards, and I went down to the police and said, look, this was men, you'd arrest them all. And this great big copper, I said, why aren't you arresting them? He said, well, it's women. There's just a terrified look on his face. And I had to have a police escort all around England. And
you had to have a police escort because why?
Death threats. Listen, police don't give you an escort because it costs a lot of money unless they're worried about it.
And why were they threatening you?
Well, for various reasons. I suppose the major one was that I was talking out. It was a time when the money was starting to come in, and I was telling the truth as loudly as I could. That's probably why. And I must remind you that Senator Ann Coulls and myself were to go to Vancouver to speak. And
Senator Ann Coulls, is this a Canadian senator?
Yes.
I see.
And supports men. And we would go to Vermont. And there was death threats from, the police said to her, do you want to go in and get on with this, or should you just cancel it? And we both said, no, we're going to go. It was very nerve-wracking.
And they hate you for saying that women can be violent or that domestic violence is often or usually mutual.
Yep, and also that I say that the fact that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry is one that absolutely enrages them because they don't want anybody to know how much money they're getting.
And it's funny, I happen to know even in the States, there's no accounting for where that money goes. It's just like, it's as smart as going to women's shelters, and that's it. It's like a black box.
Or it's not even going to women's shelters, it's going to keeping the empire going. Great big offices, loads and loads of staff. That's what happens.
Because the people in most of these houses are all volunteers or being paid hardly anything, right?
Yeah.
It's been my experience as well.
Yeah.
So you think the rage comes? Well, I might disagree with you a little, only in the sense that I know there's a lot of money involved. People don't believe it, but there is. But I also think there's I've seen it in people who have no stake in it. They become enraged with me when I say women are half the problem in domestic violence. That just suggesting women are violent makes people extremely angry. And I don't know where that comes from, but
I do find it particularly those sort of women because they're violent themselves and they know it, and men.
and yet what you just described too, there's also this protective instinct in men. In the men's movement, we call it the white knight impulse. The white knight impulse.
I call it the. To me, it's the. Oh, what's the word? It's escaped my mind now. But there is a gene in men, I think, that is put in there to take care of their children and to be gentle with their women. I think men have that.
I think men actually are, contrary to the stereotype, actually generally fairly gentle creatures.
I think that's true as well, and much simpler than women. It's much easier to talk to men because but men explode with rage, right? I can deal with that, or some men. It's women implode, and women will actually, it's true, they will sit quietly and they will plot for what they want. And that's very female because you implode with rage. Different chemicals.
So you think men and women are wired or chemically somewhat different from each other then?
Well, it's been MRI scans show men's brains and women's brains. Women's brains have scatter all across the brain because women actually could do many things at once, whereas a man's brain, when they look at the MRI scan, it's much more linear, straightforward.
So interesting. And so we've evolved to be different, and perhaps we've evolved to want to protect women.
Of course, I mean that's what you've done since the beginning of time. The woman has actually evolved to nurture the children and to nurture a family setup. That's why she collects the food, the ground food, and does the plowing. Men go out in the early days and bring home the bacon, whether it's a piece of bear or whatever. What isn't healthy though is it takes, in an ideal world, the mothering and the fathering under one roof with the children is the best way a child can grow up, being nurtured by each parent. Yes, other people can nurture a child, but that biological bond between the mother and the father is the best thing you can offer your child.
I think the nurturing impulse in men is underrated. I think men have a very strong nurturing impulse too.
They do. No, but interesting is I lived for 6 years on a farm in Italy, and the men, all cooking outside. They did all the actual backbreaking work in the farm, and the women did all the cooking in the home and looking after the children. But the fathers were equally, because they're there, because the farmers were there all day with their kids. And it was a very happy setup.
You know, it's funny. I've often thought that it's been since the Industrial Revolution that the family has actually really started the struggle, because that's where you saw father leaves and is gone all day and comes back after 12 hours. And I'm not sure that's how we evolved. I'm not sure that's all really the most natural arrangement. But perhaps I'm getting us off topic. Would you be willing to talk to me again and do another interview?
Certainly, yeah.
I'm not sure what we should close with here. But do you see reason for hope in the future, as for people getting more realistic about what domestic violence is and women's culpability and that sort of thing?
I hope so. I pray every night that this is going to happen, that we're going to recognize that the family is under serious threat. And it's everybody's job to do something about it, to come together and to make changes.
All right. Well, thank you so very much for talking to me, Erin. Again, everybody, this is episode 2 of the Honeybadger Files. My guest has been Erin Pizzey. Her book is This Way to the Revolution, a memoir from Peter Owen Publishers. Thank you so much, Erin. I hope to talk to you again very soon.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll stop recording here, but did you want to talk about anything else?
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm going to start this week, settle down and write something for the web, and I hope that was what you wanted as an interview.
It was a very wonderful interview. I can't wait to go in. I'll edit it just a little bit,
Please do.
Probably not a lot, though. I like these things to be as spontaneous and real as they can be.